Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Heart Talk HR. I'm your host, Mihaly Nagy. When I scheduled this episode 3 weeks ago, we lived in a different world. We wanted to talk about agility, future of work, and how digital is impacting the way we work and the way we shall be working in the future. And then COVID-19 became a global pandemic, and it massively hit organizations around the world. So before I start today's episode, let me start by expressing my sincere gratitude to everyone who keeps the light on: healthcare workers, truck drivers, delivery, postal services, firemen, police, and everybody else who making sure that the world can function and can remain somewhat sane in this insane world. My guest in today's episode will be Otti Vogt, the Chief Operating and Chief Transformation Officer at ING, Challenger and Growth Business, and Ricardo Troiano, the Global Head of Change and Organizational Effectiveness at Syngenta. And I asked the gentlemen to come on camera and let's talk about how the COVID-19 situation has been impacting their organization. What are some positivity that we can take away from this pandemic? And what are the new leadership models, the new leadership competencies, the new leadership qualities we need in order to bring us through to a brighter future? I hope you will enjoy today's episode, and if you do, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and visit our podcast pages on Spreaker and Spotify. At Heart Talk HR, we bring you fresh ideas and inspiring content from around the world of work. Gentlemen, Otti, Ricardo, thank you so much for coming on our show. I'm really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. I know you guys are extremely busy. It's been a crazy ride in the last 3 weeks. Just before we coming on camera, we talked about briefly that we had a concept of speed of change before this whole pandemic erupted. Now we have a new concept for speed of change. So it's just crazy what's happening. We scheduled this call actually quite a few weeks ago. That time, the goal of the conversation was to come on camera, talk about agility, talk about future of work, how digital impacting the workplace. And now it is still very relevant, but now we have a new reality. So what I'm interested in finding out from your perspective, the current situation is a true test of agility and resilience. How does your organization and how do you adjust, how do you cope with this new reality you're facing?
Maybe kicking off, and I'm sure Ricardo has some very strong views. It has been indeed a testing time for all of us. And if you allow me, Mihaly, I would like to start out with saying kind of our heart goes out truly to everybody impacted by this crisis throughout the world. And I think whatever we are doing, whatever we have been doing, it has always been about people first. And in our case, it's our customers, it's our employees, it's our stakeholders. And we've been trying through these testing times to stabilize within the anomality, if you know what I mean. And I think what has helped us a little bit is that banks in general, in terms of crisis management, are quite mature. And what I've experienced is a very quick and controlled and structured activation of our crisis management and business continuity plans. And I'm extremely proud of our teams globally who have worked very, very hard throughout the last 3 weeks to maintain customer service, to put our people at safety and to manage the risks. And I think what I've experienced is an outstanding show of commitment, quick identification of the most critical processes for customers and for the internal works of the bank, and also continuous learning, talking about agility, about how to react to small challenges before they became actual issues. So overall, it's been very, very testing in response to your question, but I had many moments where being tired, but also being very proud at the same time. I don't know, Ricardo, how it felt with you.
Yeah, Otti, I think testing was such a great word to use. Similarly, I recognize it from a sometimes position of privilege. I'm sitting here in my home, my family's safe, and there's so many people that are struggling out there, and so many of our colleagues, even at work, that are needing to be the heroes, right, to keep the supply chains moving and keep things happening. So, our thoughts are with them and support in any way we can, right? So it's as Otti said, these are trying and testing times. But similarly, at Syngenta, what I've seen is an incredible rising of folks. As we go into what we call social distancing, it's the opposite, right? We've gone into physical distancing, but social closeness, and that's what I've seen from colleagues responding around the world. We talked about it before offline. From sites manufacturing now shifting to manufacturing to get hand sanitizers out, and ultimately, you mentioned customers out here, such an important one. Our ambition is to play such a vital role in the food chain to safely feed the world, right? So we're looking at, if you think about the U.S., it's getting ready to plant and get the harvest ready. How are we getting seeds and fertilizers out there, right? Well, these are supply chain R&D folks that are working tirelessly, and the way they've kind of come together to respond and to continue to support our customers, right, farmers around the world, it has been unbelievable to see, and the leadership response has been incredible. Again, we have our challenges and we're working through them, but yeah, it's been really an incredible view and support mechanism that has gone in to meet this rising tide of change that you mentioned, Mihaly, and the speed is incredible right now.
Thank you so much for sharing so generously, and to hear that there's so many positive ideas and positivity comes out from the adversity when people are actually might be physically distant from each other, but emotionally bond and virtually try to connect and keep connecting with each other. Let's focus on Winston Churchill once said, "Never let a good crisis go waste." So from the people perspective, from the organization perspective, the future of work, which we so often sort of referring to and overused as a term, is probably here today. What are some of the good things that are coming out from this crisis or this situation that actually require you to, maybe from the organization perspective, rethink how we work, rethink how we operate, how we connect, how we take advantage of this situation on a positive way?
One of the things obviously we're looking at, like many organizations, is how do we become more of a learning organization? But there's the other side of that, which is organizational learning, right? How does the organization retain and learn the lessons? And I think we're right in the middle of it. I mean, we're a few weeks in. We were just talking there off camera, 3 weeks, quarantined. So the key here, and it's one of those principles of agility, right? And to bring that in is curiosity. How do we actually mindfully pay attention and get curious about what's happening? With thousands of us working from home, with timelines disrupted, and with a big shift in what's essential and what's not. How do we pay enough attention so that we can really understand what the advantages will be, and what, more importantly, the impacts will be to the future of work? um, and I was thinking, I was talking to a colleague today. I was living in New York City in the September 11 attacks and the aftermath, and I was a consultant, right? So I was flying, traveling every week, and we were grounded right after it happened. We were in the office in Midtown in Manhattan, and we started using these fancy video technologies for the first time, and we said, wow, we'll never travel again. The world's changed, and it did. But things went back a little bit to normal, and what lessons did we take forward? And that's kind of the spirit in which I'm taking this curiosity piece now. How are we managing these times, and what from this will continue to move forward? And probably some examples there that we can explore. Otti, what's your experience been there?
Thanks, Ricardo. I think I'm still cringing a little bit in terms of kind of a silver lining in this crisis, because there's so much human tragedy. So it feels kind of almost wrong, and B, somehow too early to say. And I was on a very interesting seminar with Sir Andrew Lickerman, who was the former Dean of London Business School, last week, talking about decision making in a crisis. And his suggestion was we very often have some unconscious biases in the way we interpret reality, and we try to compare what we're experiencing with past experiences. And his view was that in the current situation, that is almost impossible, because we have not got something in our personal history which would allow us to correctly kind of categorize what is happening today. So it's almost like, for me, this crisis is still evolving. It's too early to say what's going to happen. But I wanted to pick up on one point that you made. I think this bonding notion that you mentioned earlier, Ricardo, in terms of people across organizations, across countries coming together. So my Spanish team is telling me that the day is now ending at 8 o'clock when everybody goes on the balcony and claps for the doctors returning home, right? So the kind of these scenes and great examples of solidarity, from football stars to flower shops sending the flowers they cannot sell to hospital and so on. So I think that what personally gives me a warm feeling is in these times where I was always pondering that we had a very business-centric, productivity and growth-centric narrative in society, where sometimes it felt that people were kind of being judged based on the size of their current accounts, but instead of based on who they really are. I feel some of that emotional intimacy is coming back into our lives. But maybe beyond that, I think a few things that I'm seeing in terms of learning and then building on, again, Ricardo's point is virtual working and technology, not only in banking, but also healthcare, public services, education. I think there will be some lessons to be taken and some acceleration of digitalization. Hardening technology infrastructure is very close to my heart at the moment in terms of cybersecurity and fraud prevention and things like that. But I was always also wondering travel. Right? There's almost a feeling that on travel, kind of maybe we have overdone it a little bit in terms of the impact on the environment. And maybe this crisis makes some people learn and kind of correct a little bit what might have become excessive in regards to the economic ecological footprint of our activity. So these are some of the thoughts. But as I said, I think it's very early to tell, and we just don't know what we don't know.
But the good thing is that what we realizing at a personal and now I see organization, maybe on global level, is that to be effective and to be smart, we don't need this much to get by. There's so little is enough to get by, isn't it? So there are a lot of things we take for granted, and now it's time to remind ourselves how important it is to count our blessings and treat every day as you and I and all of us here on a call is actually, in a way, yes, we are impacted, we are in a home office, but we are healthy, and hopefully our immediate family and our surroundings are healthy. And it's a tragedy what happens around the world to many families. They're massively impacted. But we never forget to count our blessings, just to remind ourselves what really matters in life. Now, let's move on to a sort of more of a hardcore business subject, which is business agility. This is a terminology that's being used, probably a bit overused. But now it's a true test of times when to show agility in organizations. I know Otti, as it was one of the pioneers sort of rolling out agility across the organization. I know Syngenta has been experimenting it for quite a few years. Now, how has the situation, and I heard about learning, of course, as a big piece of agility, is an important element of agility. Both of you mentioned how much learning is happening and coming out from this situation. Is there anything else you'd like to share in regards to organizational, individual, HR agility? How has it changed or confirmed some of your views? And what are sort of practical tips that our viewers can take away who are currently experimenting with agility?
From an ING perspective, maybe I can offer a few thoughts on this. I think what we've always said is that in times where uncertainty and change become pervasive, we need to install mechanisms to create learning organizations, like Ricardo said, and increasingly so across cultures and countries and functional boundaries. And Agile was at the very heart of this from a methodological perspective. But I think what we've always said is that Agile is not only a method. Method is like a map of the territory, and it will always be wrong. It has to be about what are we trying to achieve. It's about being the best at getting better, so to speak. And above all, it's about creating a culture where failure is seen as an opportunity, where it's a kind of fearless organization, like Amy Edmondson is always saying. And I truly believe that BCG is right in their analysis that they offered last year, that the companies winning in the 2020s will be those who can compete on learning. And so I think in terms of the preconditions of why Agile was and is important for us, nothing has changed. It's this black swan event, as people say, right? So the unknown event that nobody could have predicted, I think just reinforces the necessity of an agile organization. And I think Ricardo alluded a little bit to it, like pace trumps perfection, right? It's about speed. It's about the length of the learning cycles in an agile organization. And if there's one thing that I believe this crisis again demonstrates, it's this kind of messianic leadership, the charismatic leadership that hope that someone will rise to the top and as a white knight lead the organization in trouble to a safe harbor is a fantasy. And I think there is a moment where control needs to be reinstated in a chaotic situation from an ontological perspective. However, what we're experiencing, because we just don't know where things will go, is that a flatter hierarchy, a listening leadership, a kind of more muted and more humble leadership is much more effective, because we have to create a human system that continually learns from the evolving crisis. And hence, I think maximizing autonomy within certain boundaries remains a core principle of organizational design. So I think, like Stephen Bungay advocates in his famous Art of Action, my recommendation to everybody watching us would be going to be very careful to revert to command and control, which many people under pressure might be very tempted to do, because their anxiety drives them to feeling that need to control somehow what is de facto uncontrollable. Ricardo, what's your experience?
You know, first of all, I love the being the best at getting better. Love that quote. I'm going to borrow it from you. And you know, I'll proudly admit that we borrowed a lot from ING in our studies of agility and what that looks like, right? One of the early views. So it's been really interesting to learn from your journey. So thank you for that. You know, it's funny, as we have always sold, or it's been sold, obviously agility is not something that's new, but it's always been sold as the answer to the VUCA world, right? And we've heard this a billion times. And if you think about volatility, uncertainty, I mean, it doesn't get more uncertain in the times that we're currently in, right? So for me, it's very much fit for purpose, but what does it mean, right? We could do so much with, and we see, you know, you mentioned culture, Otti, which is right at the heart of it, right? Mindset and culture. You know, it's not about the daily stand-up and scrums and some of these different methods and tools, and sure, they're important, right, in the way we work at times. But it really is about this view of, you know, you mentioned learning, you know, and I mentioned earlier curiosity. How do we get curious about what's happening, what works? How do we then move forward and experiment? And as leaders, how do we, you know, continue to support those experiments from a, you know, humble and servant leadership view of saying, listen, you're empowered, and I know that means that we're going to trip. It's okay, we trip as well, but if we trip and learn where we tripped so that we can get back up and, you know, be continue to be the best at getting better, loving that quote, you know, then we're going to move forward. So I think, you know, we're earlier in our journey, but we're really embracing some of these aspects, right? And they're a struggle. And Otti, you mentioned something very, very key there, which is, you know, it's very easy for us to be at our best when things are at their best. It's incredibly more challenging to be at our best when things are tough, right? And right now things can be tough, they're complex. So how do we now show up? How does the real culture reveal itself? And how do we as leaders continue to hold the line on saying, listen, I'm empowering. I'm not going to take the reins back at some level and go back to this hierarchical view only because things are tough. And I think that's going to help me. It's actually quite the opposite. You know, when we have really distributed teams now because they're working from their homes, you know, how do we really lean into this, you know, agile mindset of empowerment, again, in service of our customers, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's how do we service and bring value to our customers and continuing better in new ways.
And maybe if I can add one thing, you just triggered me there, Ricardo, is kind of I don't want to discard the methodology of Agile and the stand-ups and these interaction methods completely, because also in times of crisis, they serve to maintain the operational rigor and also give people a sense of normality. And maybe here, in addition, from a psychological angle, if you read about people like Bill Torbert, he talks about liberating structures in regards to enabling people to actually take over ownership as a team. And I think therefore these these stand-ups have a role to play. And what we've experienced throughout this crisis is that people who had tried out how to do these things in a virtual environment had a head start on the others. So maybe again, something that people might want to kind of, I'm sure they've started by now, but it would have been very good to experiment and optimize these kind of agile ways of working in a virtual environment. That has certainly helped.
And thank you so much, gentlemen, for generously contributing and sharing your views on leadership. That actually leads nicely to the next question, because obviously we need leadership. We need leaders to lead us through this situation. But I wouldn't necessarily, as you mentioned, Otti, it's not necessarily about the certain charismatic leader who will lead us through, but it's about the leadership, install the leadership qualities in the organizations. And in Davos in January earlier this year, the narrative was about world unite, capitalism as we know it dead. And we hear it that we need to have leadership qualities like emotional awareness, emotional connections, empathy, bonding, more servant leadership. Now, these qualities are not necessarily the qualities of the so-called masculine leadership. It's more of a feminine leadership quality. It's nothing to do with the gender, by the way. Would you see that the current situation we are experiencing, and of course the important direction of agility in organization, actually increases the adoption of the feminine leadership? So it's not a masculine qualities you need to display, but really this to show your vulnerability as a leader. That will help us through in the future. And what else can we advise on leadership in terms of getting the organization up and stabilize everything in this current situation?
Maybe to start, so I find this feminine versus masculine fascinating. It goes back to some Jungian psychology, and I certainly believe that the general narrative that we've created in a, let's say, as Simon Wester would say, a kind of patriarchal Western male kind of white leadership fantasy is very often forgetting some of the characteristics more often attributed to that feminine side that you mentioned. And I certainly very strongly believe that it is very important to leverage them in leadership. And Ricardo already mentioned something about kind of leadership being more of a capability that is dispersed. And here, for me, again, the current situation emphasizes a few things that I believe very strongly about leadership. The first is, in Davos, we discussed a lot about stakeholder capitalism, globally responsible leadership, leadership being there to, in a normative fashion almost, enable human systems and frameworks where individuals flourish, where they have joy, where they learn, where they can bring themselves into a working environment. Right? And I think this notion was created that we are trying to solve the world's problems profitably. That very much goes to the heart of responsible capitalism, so to speak. And I'm a big subscriber of that notion. And in that context, I think leaders, more than being those individual heroes that sometimes in a charismatic leadership sense people talk about, are there to generate organizational leadership, the ability to activate human systems to generate positive outcomes whereby people in those systems flourish. And maybe on the current crisis, I think away from that more conceptual notion, I would suggest it's really important that every leader at every level keeps healthy themselves. What I feel sometimes I'm getting more tired. It's more difficult to be optimistic, etc. And I think people need to find throughout this crisis a way to find a new way of life where they keep themselves very healthy and at their very best, because people are seeking that bounded optimism, as McKinsey tends to call it. And I think communication and caring for people. So leadership was always about caring. I think it's ever more important that people see that caring. And of course, kind of courage. There will be tough decisions to be made, and courage is part of that. Always in a virtuous sense where people truly try to optimize outcomes for the greater good. And those are some of the thoughts on my mind. Ricardo?
Yeah, no, some really, really great ones there, Otti. I'm sure I'm gonna replay some of them back. But if I go back to the ambition of Syngenta as a company, right? Part of it is to be the most collaborative and trusted team in agriculture, right? To come to the support of our farmers, right? Our customers. So if you think about that collaboration and trust, right? That gets built in the organization, right? We don't build that externally, with the NGOs we're working with their customers and the farmers out there and the distribution channels, and then work very differently at home, right? That doesn't work. You have to build that trust and collaboration at home, and you have to role model these things. So from a leadership perspective, you build trust by, these things, and a lot of these buzzwords you'll be familiar with, but how do you live them, right? What does vulnerability really look like? Well, right now it looks like, let me see. No, I've never dealt with a global pandemic of this size before, right? So I don't know the answers and I don't have the path forward, so we need to build this together. Transparency, this is what I'm thinking about right now. It could be wrong. Let's challenge it, right? Let's have a discussion and let me listen to what the perspectives are. Empathy, understanding that, my situation is very different than yours, and vice versa, and all of our colleagues around the world. So how can I, again, back to listening, how do I listen to understand, and how do our leaders listen better to understand the organization? What is it that they're going through, and how are they experiencing it? Let's not superimpose what we think they're going through, right? So this aspect of not knowing is okay, and building it together needs to be balanced again with some level of confidence, and we can sort this out. There is ultimately always some light at the end of the tunnel, right? If you think about the human condition and what we've been wired to do over our evolutionary growth, is always find a way, right? And how do we as leaders now continue to do that while balancing this aspect of vulnerability, empathy, and helping our teams? I think Otti said it very well there. And how do you really kind of drive and inspire growth well beyond yourself? And it does start, and you made the point as well, with taking care of yourself, right? Just like in planes, we were supposed to put our oxygen masks on first before we help others, and we need to do this as leaders as well, so that we can be fit to lead, I would say.
And to a degree, I think it reinforces just what some of the things we knew before. Good leadership requires a journey, kind of a pilgrimage of personal learning and evolution towards greater degrees of consciousness. Being able to relinquish controls, particularly under pressure, requires kind of personal maturity more than anything else, I would contend.
Absolutely wonderful insight. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Especially you mentioned trust. Recently, I received a very good corporate e-shot from Corporate Rebels, the team from Corporate Rebels. And they say, if you want to know how remote work in practice, just very simple 3-letter word makes it really work: trust your people. So that's all about how you, as a leader, display that you trust and empower your people, even when you don't overwatch every of their second, because working remotely is totally different than working in the office. And you just gotta be sure that they gotta be trusting them enough that they will deliver, because at the end of the day, they also have the interest of the organization in their heart. So thank you so much for sharing, gentlemen. I know you're very busy. I very much appreciate your time. And I wish you well, and I wish you safe. And those of you who like today's episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We shall be back with more Hard Talk HR content. Thank you so much. Take care and bye now.